Hi everyone, and welcome to The Climate of Sport with me, Claire Poole, the podcast where we explore how the world of sport can drive climate action, champion equality and shape a more sustainable future. From the boardroom to the locker room, from grassroots to global stages, the game is changing and so are we. Let's get into it. Hi everyone, welcome to The Climate of Sport podcast with me, Claire Poole. I am delighted to be back with you from a very hot and sticky London. We are in a red weather warning here in London, and the irony is that it's London Climate Action Week. So it's a busy week with lots of events, hopefully in air-conditioned spaces, but travelling is going to be sticky and tricky, I think. So fingers crossed it all goes well. We'll be sharing more updates across social media and a roundup on the podcast next week of all the events and all the happenings and all the takeaways if you can't make it to London Climate Action Week in person yourselves. The heat waves that we've had, we're experiencing here in the UK, also across parts of Europe, India, Asia, the US as well. A very hot period in a lot of countries right now, and very special heat in the UK, in France, in Spain, in Germany, and a lot of impact from that as well. So heat is going to be a big topic again of the podcast this week. And, a lot of it isn't the best news, to be honest, and it's quite difficult to read these stories and look at the goings on. I think what I'd love for you to think about as we talk about some of the stories that aren't the most upbeat is really thinking about how we can make sure that we are sharing and platforming this information to show how the climate crisis is impacting sport and athletes and why the movement in this area is so critical. I wrote in our issue of The Brief this week, our weekly newsletter. If you're not getting that, there'll be a link in the show notes to sign up, about how actually it's, quite difficult to read all of these stories and write about them and highlight some of the horrible impacts of the climate crisis on sport. But of course, we must persist. We must continue at raising awareness and pushing for climate action and adaptation as well as mitigation. So onwards to the climate hat trick this week. So our first story is a really sad one, but an important one that I haven't seen across that much press in Europe or North America, but being covered a lot in Asia, Southeast Asia and China. And that is Malaysian rugby players have died of heat stroke, dehydration and organ failure. So I just want to read a quote to start off with, because I think it sets the tone. The quote is, "Aslan scored a try for us about a minute before half time. He then said he wasn't feeling well, but still walked towards the centre line for the restart. Just before the restart, he became unstable and was asked to sit down. He then collapsed and was taken to hospital." That was what the team manager of 22-year-old rugby player Aslan Azari described the moments before he collapsed during Agona's Cup match against Johor on the 23rd of May, 2026. He was initially placed in a medically induced coma, but unfortunately, really sadly and tragically later died in hospital. The cause of death was given as heat stroke, dehydration, and organ failure. Reading about this, honestly, I found very affecting, because even his manager talking about how he was obviously feeling in that moment, and the core of an athlete and their teammates to then continue to walk back to the centre line for a restart, even though he was obviously and ended up being so critically unwell, I think is a real insight into the mindset of athletes and why sport is a real bellwether of the impacts of the climate crisis, and one we need to keep raising awareness of. On the same day, 21-year-old Mohammed Adam Putra Cyril, he was a Penang Sukma player, also collapsed during a training session, and he sadly died after being taken to hospital as well. His was classed as a sudden death, and there are waiting further findings from investigations on that. The temperature where he was training was around 32 degrees centigrade in Colleen, like Aslan Azari. That hasn't been attributed to the climate crisis, that hasn't been attributed to heat stroke, but obviously a sudden death, further investigations, and he was training in very high temperatures. But we obviously don't want to take the next step of saying that is the same circumstance. And again, a lot of the press coverage also highlighted 13 days before these two tragic deaths, a former national team scrum half, Mohammed Karul Abdullah Ramli, who was 34, suffered an aortic rupture on the bus home after an Agong Cup match. Again, that was not attributed to heat stroke, but a lot of the press coverage saying 3 deaths in quick succession is raising awareness of heat for sport in the country. These 3 deaths have prompted so many headlines in especially Malaysian, Southeast Asian and China press, and linking them to Malaysia's extreme heat. As I mentioned, only one's been directly attributed to heat stroke, and that's one too many. Reports indicate that World Rugby's heat management protocols, including water breaks every 20 minutes, were followed. And Malaysia, we know, is a country that is already experiencing rising temperatures alongside severe floods, droughts, sea level rise caused by the climate crisis. So these tragedies have renewed attention on the risks that extreme heat pose to athletes. We know all sport inevitably carries risk, and few would argue that athletes should be wrapped in cotton wool, but rugby in particular obviously is built on physical challenge and endurance and resilience. But as temperatures continue to rise and extreme heat becomes more common, the question is no longer whether sport should adapt, but of course, how quickly. One death linked to heat stroke is one too many, and it's something that should be raising a lot of alarm bells for sport all over the world. We love sport, obviously, for the passion, the competition, the sense of community it brings. But at what point do we take a serious look at what we are asking athletes to endure? And how can we support them whilst understanding that to get to the levels of sport that these athletes are competing at does require incredible resilience and also, a bloody-minded attitude. When I speak to a lot of athletes, that determination really is there. And pushing themselves. That is literally the DNA of an athlete. So how can we take a duty of care to support them and make sure that they are protected from pushing themselves to these extreme measures? Conditions that were once exceptional are now becoming the norm, and governing bodies need to seriously start considering whether existing safeguards are enough to protect those taking to the field. And these stories, unfortunately, are keeping coming. Something that I think we can all relate to is if you are in a country right now that's experiencing a heat wave and the lack of sleep that you get when we have these tropical nights, and even just walking around or commuting in these temperatures. As you're walking around, maybe you're listening to this, in London during the red warning of the extreme heat. Imagine then playing 4 hours and 40 minutes of sport at the highest level like tennis in that heat, or imagine playing rugby, imagine gearing up and playing rugby for 80 minutes in that heat at the highest level. I know athletes are trained and they are absolutely incredible and they can endure it more than us normal people can. However, I often, when I'm in these periods of heat, I find it difficult just to walk around and get on and off the tube and, sort of not be covered in sweat. How can they possibly feel and how are we protecting them? The second climate hat-trick story is, of course, the FIFA World Cup Roundup for this week. Let's get into what's happened in the past week. There are 3 themes that are colliding around FIFA Men's World Cup 2026 right now. They are disruption, heat, and mounting political pressure around the tournament's environmental footprint. So first, disruption has finally arrived. We experienced it in a couple of the warm-up matches, but now in the main tournament, we had the first major disruption of the World Cup, which was in Philadelphia between France and Iraq. It was halted for over 2 hours due to thunderstorms and lightning, something many had been expecting at some point of the tournament, so not a massive surprise that this is happening. We will see it happen again. But what caught everyone's attention wasn't just the delay itself, but it's what came after. The now vaunted, discussed, controversial hydration break was scrapped in the second half. And that inconsistency in terms of approach has sharpened scrutiny of FIFA, raising the question fans and teams keep circling back to: are these breaks genuinely about player welfare, or are they negotiable depending on the circumstance, which is what obviously we are now seeing has taken place. The debate matters more because of what's happening, obviously, with heat. Conditions across the tournament have been punishing in some places. So Miami, especially for the Saudi Arabia-Uruguay match, Monterrey for Sweden versus Tunisia, both recorded wet bulb globe temperatures above 28 degrees Celsius in open-air stadiums. Dallas had England and Croatia, which was 35 degrees across the opening matches. But of course, in Dallas, it's a closed stadium. So the players themselves weren't affected, but people attending the game, commuting around Dallas were. 6 of the first 24 matches have already hit or exceeded the 28 degrees wet bulb globe temperature threshold. And even more concerning, there's now been an on-field incident as well. Referee Felix Zweier required treatment after suffering cramp, which put him down during the US-Australia match in really unseasonal, humid Seattle conditions, not a venue that we were expecting to see these impacts in. Indoor venues, as mentioned, have offered some protection, but the contrast is really stark, and it feeds directly into the next flashpoint that, of course, we're going to talk about, hydration breaks. So after that controversial decision by FIFA to scrap the second one during the delayed France game, criticism has, quite rightly, intensified. Uruguay manager Marcelo Bielsa called the rule, quote, something that adds nothing and takes a lot away. While fan reaction has also shifted in the past week, visible booing of hydration pauses in multiple matches. And I read a headline this morning that said the DJs are having to fight this and they're trying to put on bangers, that incite karaoke and singing along to try and overcome those booing in stadia. The longer this goes on, the more it feels like perception is hardening around this, and people are saying this is less a safety measure and more a commercial or bureaucratic imposition. So let's get it straight on hydration breaks. As a recap, hydration breaks have been treated in this tournament by FIFA as a default welfare protocol. They have been put in place in the first and second half of matches, no matter where the matches are taking place, whether they are in more milder locations or even if they're in indoor stadiums. As a reminder, heat breaks or hydration breaks were historically a responsive intervention. When temperature reached a certain height, then the cooling break was put in place to enable player safety. They've been mandated in all matches, including those indoors and not at high temperatures. And this is what we've been led to believe. And I don't need to repeat the feedback from fans about how they feel, and from pundits and from footballers themselves and from managers and coaches about their feeling around this when they feel these breaks are unnecessary and they dip the momentum of the match. Thomas Tuchel said they have had a much bigger impact on the momentum of the game than he thought, Thomas Tuchel being the England manager. So the first match of the tournament now that's been seriously impacted by extreme weather, which is the France-Iraq match, was delayed by over 2 hours because of these storm impacts, and then the break was scrapped in the second half. In other words, the system is rigid when it should be adaptive and then flexible when it suits the circumstances. That is now what we're seeing. Removing hydration breaks after the long weather interruption seems to create the opposite of the supposed stated intent of a default welfare protocol. Critics, of course, will say they didn't need a hydration break anyway. The game restarted much later in the day. They had been delayed already. The athletes themselves, the teams, the coaches, the fans, everyone will have wanted that game to reach its conclusion as quickly as possible. It was a common sense approach. Don't disagree with that at all. But that common sense approach has not been applied across the tens of games all over Canada, US, and Mexico to date. So when it comes to the player welfare perspective from FIFA, it is looking more and more sketchy when these decisions are made in the moment. I think what we need is at least consistency when it comes to what's happening. And again, my big concern in terms of the fact that we need these hydration breaks to happen more and more, going back to our first story of the impact of extreme heat on sports and on athletes, these hydration breaks are going to become more and more normalized. And my big concern with this is that they have now been stigmatized across this match by being used when they're not necessary. And this will stay in sports fans' collective memory. And then when they are instigated because they're absolutely necessary, athletes may push back against them because of the thoughts associated with them. I'm really concerned about the long-term impacts of this tournament and what it means for hydration breaks that are truly necessary in the future. Okay, so finally, the politics around the tournament are spilling into the streets. So climate activists staged coordinated protests targeting Saudi Aramco, sponsorship ties with FIFA, and there were protests across Los Angeles, Miami, New Jersey, Seattle, and Dallas, including the main demo outside, not SoFi Stadium. Also in Guadalajara, protests ahead of the Mexico versus South Korea game happened, focused on another FIFA sponsor, Hyundai, and its industrial links to steel producer Ternium, with campaigners raising concerns about environmental harm and alleged links to wider human rights issues. So there has been a lot of tension in terms of some of the partners that FIFA has chosen to work with for this World Cup. The early weeks of the tournament are already defined by a familiar World Cup tension spectacle on the pitch, lots of upsets, lots of results that are unexpected, and excitement and some really, really good football, which is brilliant, but growing friction off it between the heat, scheduling, and the politics of who is funding this tournament to take place. A last note on this, Brazilian media outlet UOL has reported that Gianni Infantino, president of FIFA, has travelled as of the 21st of June, a total of 34,000 kilometres by private jet to go to games. Just another angle of the impact of the tournament and the impact the tournament's having, and also the perception, the optics of how the climate crisis is being perceived. The last story in our climate hat trick is the London Marathon. The London Marathon is seeing double. Okay, for 2027 only, the London Marathon is going to go into a 2-day event with 100,000 runners taking on the iconic route from Greenwich to Westminster across the 24th and 25th of April. As a reminder, in the last couple of years, there has been about 55,000 places for the London Marathon, and they have had this year, I think, 1.3 million people enter the ballot to get places. There has been a huge demand for the London Marathon over the last couple of years. It is absolutely iconic. So this one-time gig for 2027 only, it's going to be a 2-day event. Organisers are calling it a citywide celebration of sport, charity, music and community. And it's obviously a massive win for two different groups. One, participants, because people want to do the London Marathon. So now what had been a certain number of places is now massively increased. So more chance to run the marathon if that's your gig. And also the fundraising, obviously. The London Marathon is one of, if not the biggest day for fundraising for charities in sport globally. So it's a really big win for that. But what about the environmental math? Let's think about that. So the London Marathon has pledged to reach net zero in 4 years' time by 2030. There were 60,000 runners that finished, nearly 60,000 runners that finished in 2026. So we're going to increase by about 40% in terms of the number of participants. And that, of course, is going to impact the target of reaching net zero in 4 years' time, because out of those 4 years, one of them is going to have a massively increased footprint. The biggest carbon driver, obviously, is travel, especially from international runners and spectators. And more people mean more emissions, although organisers do apply a carbon levy on international entries to try and compensate for the impact of the carbon caused. Extra guaranteed entries have also been allocated to every London borough along the route, which is great to hear, because if the majority or some or quite a few of those places are taken by people who live locally to the route, then obviously emissions are going to be much lower than those perhaps who travel internationally to compete. The event is stretching over 2 days, and it's going to potentially ease pressure on infrastructure and operations. Once it's set up, it's in place, there's potential improved efficiencies rather than simply double the impact. And there's also a discussion of impact of the event versus carbon footprint per participant, which is also something for us to think about. We're going to come back on that because we're giving that some thought. So the real question isn't about whether the marathon gets bigger, it's about whether it can scale up without running away from its climate goals. Okay, there are headlines for today. The first one, very sadly, the Malaysian rugby player that died of heatstroke, dehydration and organ failure. The FIFA Men's World Cup 2026 Roundup, and seeing double the London Marathon absolutely is. That's it for this week's edition of the Climate of Sport podcast. I'm off to a bunch of London Climate Action Week events. I'll be giving you updates and we'll share more on the pod next week. I hope you have a great week. Keep cool, and looking forward to catching up again next week. That is a wrap on this episode of the Climate of Sport. If this got you thinking, send it to the group chat, send it to your team or someone who cares about the future of the game. Follow, subscribe and join us next time, because the biggest wins aren't just on the scoreboard, they're out there for the planet too. See you on the next one.